everybody, how's it going out there? My name's Jared Johnson. I'm a drum instructor at Music Compound, and today I'm going to be doing a Facebook Live just on how to basically tune drums and how to replace drum heads. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about like drum head choice as far as getting the sound that you want and what drum heads to choose for that, and then also maybe a little bit of muffling as well, which is obviously pretty related. So, if you're going to be tuning your drum heads and or replacing them, there's a couple things you're going to want to have handy. Obviously, one of them is going to be a drum key. They come in all shapes and sizes. It's just a four-sided bolt adjuster basically. So it's a four-sided bolt you're going to be tweaking with this, but you can find them at any drum store on Amazon for a couple bucks. So I also have here, because I'm going to be replacing heads, I have a drill with a drum key bit on it. I never use one of these for, well, you can start the bolts into the drum head a little, or into the drum a little bit with this, but I would never recommend tuning with this because it's going to move a little too fast probably, and you could easily damage a head. So, but I use this to take drum heads off, and then if there's a lot of space between where the bolt is like reaching the head and where it's actually screwing in, then I'll use this to get it started at least until it starts to actually put pressure on the drum head. But after that, I do everything by hand. So I will have one of these handy. And then also I have some moon gels here, which are for dampening. That's not really that imperative for tuning. You won't need those yet. So the last thing you'll want to have is, depending on where you're doing your tuning and stuff, you're going to want to remove, like if you have your toms mounted or whatever, your bass drum, that kind of thing, you're going to want to pull those all out so that they're not, you can turn them on their sides or on their back. This is the bass drum or whatever. So you can muffle the bottom head. And so you'll see I have a beach towel here sitting on top of one of my floor toms, so I can muffle the bottom head of this drum when I'm tuning the top, and when I flip it over I can muffle the top head while I'm tuning the bottom. If you don't do that and you just tune while it's mounted on, you know, your bass drum, like your toms for example, or just a floor tom sitting on a stand, right, you're going to be hearing both drum heads resonating at the same time, and that's going to complicate matters. So if you just set it on top of your couch, whatever, anything that'll muffle the bottom head. So alright, so without further ado, I want to talk about the type of drum heads that can give you different sounds. So, a lot of people, you know, who are going to be watching this and interested in this are probably own a drum kit that they purchased from a dealer or from a private seller, and it probably just has stock drum heads on it, maybe not, but the drum heads that come with a drum kit that you buy typically are going to be not the best quality. I mean, even if it's a nicer drum kit like DW, for example, which is a, you know, very high-end company, they're still going to put, you know, not like the crazy best, most expensive heads on there. They're going to put kind of generic ones, and it's going to be like single ply, which can work for some styles, and that's fine. But especially if you're getting like, you know, an entry-level kit or like a medium or even bordering into the upper echelons of drumming quality, you're still probably going to get some fairly thin heads. And I think it's interesting that some of those tuning methods and the heads that people choose, when I don't think they know what they're trying to, I mean, with the sound they have in mind, you'd think they were probably, you know, look into the head choice a little bit more, because I think some of them are trying to achieve a certain sound and probably going about it the wrong way. So I would say head choice and tuning can have a huge, probably almost more of a difference in some ways than the actual drums themselves as far as the sound. Now, I mean, obviously having a really, really expensive kit is going to have a lot more sustain and like better quality tone to it in the first place. But at the same time, depending on how it's tuned, I mean, you know, if you like playing rock drums and gospel and R&B, and you hear someone's really amazing, you know, $8,000 drum set, but it's tuned to like jazz tunings, you're probably not going to like that drum sound that much. So a lot of it has to do with the head choice and the tuning. So yeah, so here's a bottom head, a resonant head from like an entry-level drum kit. I think it was a Pearl EXP or something like that. It's a 12-inch head. This is super thin. So, and actually, just so you know, the top head was actually the same exact thing. So this would kind of work this would work okay for a resonant head, the bottom head that you're not actually hitting on the drum. So this head over here. But, you know, the same thickness head comes on the top. And so with a thin head like this, you're not going to get as much attack. And it's also going to be, you can hear kind of like flimsy it is. You're going to get a lot of overtones. So overtones, I think, are a big thing for a lot of people. They're trying to figure out how to get rid of that ring to their drums, you know. They want that like kind of focused sound often. They don't necessarily want a lot of sustain or that kind of odd ringing that seems kind of harsh or like annoying. And so these heads kind of honestly, if you have these for like a batter head, you're going to have a lot of overtones, so you'll have to muffle more, and plus you're not going to have that kind of focused tone with this is basically a single ply drum head. So we have single ply drum heads, you've got double ply drum heads. It's just, literally two pieces of plastic that are like crimped together at the ends. And so there's a bunch of different variations as far as the thickness of the plies and all that kind of stuff to determine the different sound qualities. But this is basically a cheapo, what comes in your drum kit, and it's not going to have the best tone. So if you're, obviously if you get it tuned right, you're going to have better tone than if you have it tuned unevenly and all that stuff. And so we'll get into that. But if you're trying to replace drum heads, or if you're wondering why you're having trouble getting a good sound, it could be just the heads that, maybe you want something like if you're into, like a gospel or rock, pop sounds, R&B, that kind of stuff. Typically, those modern drum tunings are, they're using like 2-ply heads for their toms, sometimes 2-ply heads for their snare drums, which I'm not a big fan of, but whatever. And then 2 plies, usually on the bass drum batter head as well. So a lot of it would have, double the thickness of this thing basically. Also, having those 2 plies on top of each other kind of helps get rid of some of the overtones and also shortens the sustain while increasing the attack. So attack just being like the sharpness of the sound, I guess just how sharp the sound is, right, when you first hit it. And then the sustain is going to be pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, longer sustain is going to mean it rings out a little bit more. Shorter sustain, it doesn't really ring out as much. Yeah. So this is kind of a typical one. So over here today I have a couple toms that I'm going to change out the heads on. I have just a tom, this is just a Stage Star. I basically have several drum kits that I rent out to students. Shameless plug here. So if you know anyone who needs a drum kit to rent for right now because they don't have one, maybe your parents don't want to spend the money on one right away until they know you're really interested and going to stick with it, so you can always rent a drum set for me. But I have a drum kit that needs some new heads for one of my rental kits. So I'm going to put a new 10-inch head on my rack tom here and a new 14-inch head on this smaller floor tom. This is a smaller drum kit with like an 18-inch bass drum and stuff. So for some of the younger guys or people who like jazz. But this is an Evans EC2 clear head. This one is a 2-ply head. So it's actually got 2 pieces of plastic on there. And basically it's got this little overtone control ring in there. And that's going to kind of eliminate some of the overtones. Some of those high, like ringy tones that you get out of it. So I'm going to put that on my 10-inch tom, and I have a matching one for the 14-inch tom. So we'll talk a little bit more about head choice later on as far as bass drums and snare drums and all that. But I guess we'll just get started on tuning for those who are just here for the tuning aspect. So, yeah. Let's see here. So I'm going to start tuning up my snare drum a little bit here. And just to go over the basics of how to do this, generally speaking, and if you've done a little bit of drum tuning, you may already know this, they will often say to tighten or loosen, whatever you're doing, to do it in a star-shaped pattern, so alternating sides and trying to, like, not just go in a circle, basically. And that's really good advice. For the most part, I would say that's true. I think in certain circumstances, if you're very, like, mild about how you do it, you can go in a circle, but overall, I would say go in a star pattern, okay? Especially when starting on a drum head, if you're putting on a new one, so that's a big part of it. It's kind of like changing out a wheel on a car. You always go in a star pattern, so you're not, like, over-tightening one side, and then you have uneven tension eventually. So, and you can actually, if you go too much on one side, and then just go on, you'll end up, like, tightening one side so much that the drum head actually warps, and you can actually damage the drum head to the point where you pretty much need to get a new one, even if it's a brand new head. So, be careful of that. But basically, generally speaking, I'm going to need my towel here underneath my snare drum to stop my bottom head from rattling and resonating. Okay, and I'm going to use a drumstick. And then basically what I want to do is I want to go around and see if, because we have all these different lugs all the way around, we can actually have a little bit different tension at each one of these, which is going to produce a different pitch. So if I've got, 10 lugs here, if I have like 10 different pitches going at the same time and they're not even, that's going to produce a lot of harsh, ringy overtones. Not only will it be like ringy, but it's going to be pretty harsh because it's all clashing frequencies. In the same way that you hit like a chord that's really bad on the piano, it's going to be very dissonant. You have that same thing kind of going on with the drum head if you don't have them all tuned evenly. So I haven't tuned this one in probably a week or so, so it may already have some of that just from kind of settling and that kind of thing. So we're gonna go around and see. Now, one thing you can do is some people like to put a finger on the middle of the head to kind of like stop some of the other sides from interfering and like hearing some of the other overtones from the other side. That is one thing that, you know, it's gonna take a little bit of training when it comes to just doing it a lot. When it comes to like hearing properly, in terms of drums produce a lot of overtones in general, so you kind of have to like listen through that and listen for like the main like pitch rather than all the ringy overtones sometimes. So that can help. Just be careful if you're going to do that, because some people will, like, I've seen people do it and they're like pressing down with their finger really hard. That's going to tighten the drum head and change the pitch. So I would say, you know, if you're going to do that, just rest your finger on there gently. You can tap with your finger. I like to use a drumstick, so. So overall, pretty similar in pitch. And I'm also going to, when I'm doing this, I'm going to be checking like across from each other. Those should be matching, and you'll probably want to get those, you know, you'll match these up, for example, and then I'll probably go to over here and match these two up. And then once I start to get like all these pairs evened up, as I'm going, I'm probably going to listen for, oh, is this one like way different? And if that happens where I get to one that's like super low or something like that, or particularly high compared to the other ones, I'm probably going to adjust that there. But if all of them seem to be about the same and I get them going across, then I'm going to go around and check them all compared to each other. But in the meantime, I'm going to be mostly working across from each of them. Also, part of that is to keep it, you know, not uneven tuning around the head. So. So to me, it sounds like these two are a little bit higher, barely, than these guys. So more than likely, I'm going to be going up in pitch, but these seem pretty even. So I don't need to worry about balancing those two out. I just need to worry about balancing them to this, or if I want the tone to be a little bit higher, then I would bring these up to this. But let's keep on going around. So. Okay, so the only thing I'm noticing is that these two are a little uneven, I think, actually, at this point, upon further reflection. So, so typically, it's kind of a strange thing, but when they're uneven, if it's by a very small amount, I would usually start with, let's say this side sounds lower to me, and I want to make that higher. Rather than going to this exact lug, I actually start at the opposite side. I don't really have a great answer with why to start there, but it seems to work better than just going straight there. A lot of times just bringing up the opposite side helps to even out the tension nice. If there's a big difference in the pitch, then I go to that same lug, but I think I was watching a video with like Dave Weckl one time giving some tuning advice, and he's a pretty well-renowned drummer, and his drums usually sound pretty great. So I kind of listened to that, and it seems to work well. Anyway, so this side seems a little lower to me, so I'm actually going to go over here. Yeah, you might have heard a crack just now, so I keep my snare tuned pretty tight. If you like a low, fatter sound, you can definitely just go for a lower pitch. But no matter what tuning you go for, whether you want like really high and pretty cracky, like the snare drum is, or if you want like a fatter sound, you can tune it lower. You know, it doesn't really matter. You're still going to want all the lugs tuned evenly. So the same principle applies. If you want like a lower sound, just tune it lower. So I think that's all. So that one lug sounds lower than all the rest. Cool. And so as you're doing it, you're going to want to listen and tap as you turn. And so you should obviously hopefully hear the pitch go up if you're tightening, or hear it go down. If you turn quite a bit and you're not getting into that, you might have to go to the opposite side and try that. See if that helps. So also when you're doing this, you want to have it generally kind of get a feel for what's a quarter turn, what's a half turn, where like, so if you look at my handle here, you know, turning it 180 degrees, you want to kind of have a feel for that. Don't be like, you know, cranking down 3 turns on this side and half a turn on this side. You should probably kind of get a little bit of a feel for, here's a quarter turn, you know, that. Here's a half turn all the way around, you know, twice, so whatever. But at that point, if I have this head kind of where I want it, generally speaking, I'm gonna go check out the bottom head now. Now with snare drums, it's gonna be a little bit of a pain because of the snares in the way. So you might have to loosen your snare wires, which for snare drums, there's always gonna be a little, where your snare throw off is, which turns the snares on and off. There's gonna be a little knob that you rotate counterclockwise, that'll loosen the snares. I don't keep mine super tight anyway, so I'm gonna loosen it just a little bit. But then I'm gonna take my throw off and turn the snare to the off position. I'm gonna flip this over. Now, what we're gonna wanna do is we're going to take a drumstick and carefully, and if you don't have like a decent amount of slack where you can fit a drumstick underneath there, like right now, I have probably a good like almost inch of slack over here on this side where I'm lifting up. So I don't have to worry about it, it's not gonna be a problem. But if it's still pretty tight and you can't do that, maybe get like at least an inch on one side, or 3/4 of an inch, something like that, you may want to loosen up your snare a little bit more so you don't damage it. Then very carefully, take your drumstick, run it underneath there, and then I kind of slide mine into the middle and let it rest on the middle. I haven't bent my snare wires, you know, they can flex a little bit back and forth, it's not going to hurt them as long as you're not like yanking them, right? Or if it's so tight that they're like all being pulled to one side or something. So as long as you do that carefully, you're good. Then we're going to go around, now that we have the snares hopefully not touching the drum head at all, and we're going to these sound lower to me. Ooh, well, that'll do it. This one was like super loose. Okay, so if that happens, it doesn't happen very often to me, but if you have one that's like totally loose on one side and not so much on the other, one thing you can do right away is kind of loosen up that side a little bit, add tension. So it may be that like I just don't have a completely even surface on here, although it's the VW Collector Series, so I imagine it's pretty even. But for whatever reason, that one just happened to loosen up a little bit. So. You may have to turn the drumstick if it's in the way of your tuning was. So right now these guys seem higher to me. Also, I guess it bears pointing out, when you're tapping your drum head, don't wail on it, you know, especially if you're on like a bottom head that's meant for resonance, not for, you know, bashing away on. So be kind of gentle with this. Plus it's not going to help your tuning if you're you know, hitting really hard in general. So, and generally speaking, try to have the same amount of oomph every time you hit, because the harder you hit, it's going to change the pitch a little bit too. Okay, so right now those all seem to be pretty even to me. At this point, what I'm going to do is I want to see, actually I'll leave that in there, I want to see, you know, the relationship between the two heads now. I think I have them tuned pretty well to themselves as far as all being even on each side, but we also have to think about with two-headed drums, what's the relationship between the two pitches, top and bottom. So generally speaking, like for toms, a lot of people will tune them to unison, so the same pitch ideally. Some people will actually go as far as to do specific intervals, like a minor third or something on the bottom head. So the bottom head is actually a little bit tighter maybe. Some people say that produces like a nice kind of, the frequencies like meshing together is really nice, so for resonance and that kind of thing. So I've never really experimented with that, trying to tune specifically to a minor third, but I do want to play with that one day. Usually I just tune mine to unison, and that seems to give me like a nice good sound without too much overtones or weird ringing. So that's what I typically do for toms. Snare drum, a lot of people will tune the bottom head tighter to give it a little more articulation, so tighter than the batter head, the head you're hitting on the top. So the bottom head will be tighter than the top head. And that will increase your articulation and stuff. Sometimes it does if you're not careful. Some people will crank it down like considerably tighter than the top head. I don't like doing that too much because you kind of lose some of the body and like the fatness of the sound. when you really do that, but it does help to increase the articulation. So I usually tune mine a little bit higher on the bottom than on the top. Let's see what the top sounds like here. So also right now while I'm doing this, I have my hand on the bottom head since I have it sideways. I don't have my towel touching it. That way I'm only hearing the top head. So right now I'm actually a little bit lower on the bottom head. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead, since I have it about even, I'm going to go ahead and do a quarter turn on each of these lugs. And I'm going to go in a star pattern. Just kind of keep track of which ones you've done. It's not super critical that you do them exactly, but I actually kind of messed up there a little bit. But as long as you're not cranking around in a circle, you'll probably be fine, okay? And just try to hit all the lugs evenly. So. Okay, I'm definitely a little bit higher than my top head now. So at this point, I think that's going to be a good relationship, good enough for me. Now, some people might say, well, why didn't you just start and like figure out if that was the same or like a little bit higher than the one below? Well, if you have uneven tension on your lug, which is very possible, if you've never tuned your drum kit before or you didn't know to tune them lug by lug to each other, it's very possible that your drum set is already like, could be drastically out of tune lug to lug. So you might hear one that's high pitched and be, oh yeah, that's higher, so I'll just tune everything to that. And then it gets dramatically higher in pitch rather than just being a little bit, you know? So even them all out before you try to compare one head to the other. So that way you know you have even pitch all around. That might have been my loose lug earlier. About even. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and check and see how my snare drum sounds. Probably be a little bit more gentle than that when taking your drumstick out, but I'm not too terribly worried. I'm going to tighten my snare back up a little bit. If it's kind of hard to do that, you can always take your thumb down a little bit and then put it back on. Tighten it up just a little bit more. And so, like I said, I like my snare drums pretty tight with a decent amount of crack to them. But it's still, one of the things I love about the snare is it still sounds really good even if it's cracked down. You can still hear some like body to the snare, it doesn't sound too thin. So that's for a snare drum, how we would tune that. The same concept applies for a bass drum or a rack tom or a floor tom or whatever. You want your, each lug to be tuned to each other evenly as well as you can by ear. Oh, and I wanted to point out too, there are some like tuning helpful devices out there. So there's one called the drum dial, for example, and that one's actually really cool because it's actually measuring the pitch on the drum head by the lug. That's great. They're kind of expensive, I think. I've always wanted to get one, but I've never really done it. I get by well enough by ear. So that would be a really cool device to use. What I don't recommend getting is something like a torque key. So a torque wrench, as I'm sure a lot of you may know, is basically as you're tightening, if you set the dial to a specific amount of tension that you want. So in theory, let's say, I don't know how many Newton meters or whatever, but like you set it to whatever tension you want. As soon as you get to that tension, the wrench kind of pops and you know you stop tensioning at that point. That it's already reached the tension you want. So they have like an Evans torque drum key, and it's a great idea in theory, but as you go around, if you're tensioning each one of these lugs to each other so that they're all the same tension, that sounds like it's perfect. Okay, I'll have even sound. Not necessarily true. That would have to mean that the entire surface of the bearing edge, like where the head rests on the drum, is like totally even all around. There's no dust in there that's like making it slightly less level or anything like that, which, I mean, it's just not going to happen basically. If you really go around and listen, I've used one of those before and then listened to each part, and they don't sound the same. So, I mean, you could try and use it as like a general, start, I suppose, but in the end, you would really want to tune by ear. So it's not necessarily one of those torque keys that isn't going to give you perfect pitch all the way around. So just keep that in mind. So I really don't recommend buying those, honestly. I would just start training your ear or buy a drum dial or something similar to that. Okay, so we did the snare drum. At this point, I'm going to start talking about how to change out drum heads, and then we'll actually see how to tune a tom as well. So let me get this out of here. Okay. Towel back up here. All right, so I'm going to be replacing the batter head, the top head for this this 10-inch tom. Like I said, I have some Evans EC2s to put on there. They're actually not my go-to #1 choice for heads, but this is a rental drum set, so I don't spend. The heads I like for my personal drum kit over here are pretty expensive, so these are actually pretty nice, but I just happen to have them lying around. One of them, so I just bought another one to match it. My personal favorites for the kind of music I play, which is largely rock and maybe some R&B and like funk and gospel type stuff, are Aquarian reflector heads. They're Eric Moore's signature heads. Let's get a phone call. Okay, we got so Aquarian reflector drum heads. They're pretty great. They're a little bit thicker than a typical 2-ply, but they are 2-ply heads. They have a nice amount of sustain, but not too much. So depending on what you like, these could be a great choice. I think I said they're Eric Moore's signature drum head. If you don't know who Eric Moore is, check him out on YouTube. You will have your mind blown. But his sound is really good for his toms, to me personally. Also, he has DW drums that have a lot of sustain, so I think it kind of balances out pretty well. But anyway, so these EC2s, the first thing I need to do is remove the old drum head, obviously. Now, if you don't care about the old drum head, this one's pretty battered. It has some dents in it and stuff like that, and it's been pretty well played. So I'm not too concerned with it. However, I may actually save some of the plastic so I can use it for, not really for muffling, but achieving certain different sounds. So what I'm going to do later on, I'll show you how to do this, is to, well, I'll probably just explain it. Actually, I don't feel like doing that. Is you can kind of cut out the ring that goes around the drum head, and then you can be left with the plastic, which you can put on your own drums to give you some different tone options if you like a really muffled sound, or if you're just using it for an effect, basically. But the point I want to make is, if the heads you have are maybe like good backups and they're not too beat up and you want to keep them, I would be gentle about just going around in a circle to remove them, or just with my drill here, just going crazy on one leg at a time. But because I don't worry about warping the drum head at all, I'm just going to go ahead and use a drill and pull them all off. So, if you've never done that before by hand, you know that's pretty sweet to have a drill. And then what I try to do is I just keep my my little tension rods in there in the hoop, so they're kind of there when I need them. Hopefully you can set those down somewhere where they won't all just fall out. Another thing you might want to do at this time, as you're playing, a lot of your wood shavings from hitting your cymbals or hitting the rims of your drums, if you play on those or if it's by accident, those wood shavings can get in between that metal rim and the surface of the head, so they kind of collect in this little lip around here. So just keep that in mind when you're doing this. If you don't want your floor dirty, for example, you might want to take this and dump it in the trash can, or just throw it right away if you don't want to keep it. This isn't really too much of a problem for me in this case, so but especially if the drums are really old or if they sat around for a while, you could have a lot of that dirt and gunk built up in there. So just keep that in mind, and you may also want to clean that off the bottom of your hoop before you reinstall it. So I'm just going to set this aside though. Pretty dead sounding. This one actually kind of has, you probably can't hear it over Facebook Live, but it has a little more solid attack to it. It doesn't sound so worn in. And it has overall a similar amount of sustain, but these are a little bit different heads. This one is a 2-ply head, but it doesn't have any of that overtone control ring on it, so a little more sustain typically from it, and a little more ring, but it's the price you pay sometimes for sustain. Okay, if you're particular about how your logos on your drum head are, there's an Evans logo up here at the top, and you want that matching up with like the badge on the front of your drum or whatever it's going to be positioned on your drum set. Keep that in mind. I know some people are very like, oh, the logo's not at the top, it bothers me. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. So if that bothers you, you may want to pay attention to where that is in relationship to how it's mounted on your drum kit so that the labels are all up when you look at it. I don't really care, but I just put them with the badge. Then I'm going to basically get these all lined up, and I'm going to just gently thread them in by hand, just enough that they start to bite inside there. And at this point, like I said, if you do decide to use a drill and you have one and you've got one of these drum key bits, just be careful. At this point, I'm only, you can see between the lip of this bolt and the lip of the hoop is maybe like, not even quite, about ½ inch maybe. So I'm just gonna, get rid of that space on each one, but I'm not actually going to start to tension any of them. There's not gonna be any pressure down on the head really. And I'm also gonna put my drill on like a lower speed and do it that way, okay? And then I just leave the last little bit. You notice I just finished tightening that by hand. Just enough where it's starting to like snug down a little bit. Same thing there. Okay, and then once those are all about to where they're just starting to touch the lip of the hoop and start to put pressure on the drum head, that's where I kind of stop with the finger tightening and definitely with the drill at that point. And then there are a couple different things some people like to do. Some people like to really push down hard on the head at this point to kind of help it settle. As the drum head settles, it's kind of like guitar strings. It'll obviously loosen up faster when it's just been put on new. So it'll require a little more tweaking early on once you have put a new drum head on. So you can do that. There's nothing wrong with it. You're not going to hurt it really. And then if you want to do that, that's fine. If not, you can just start the tuning process. So what we're going to do here is we want to make sure, once again, this is where it's really important when you're starting a drum head, that you are doing the same amount at each particular lug and going across in the start pattern. Also, you may notice early on, like right now as I'm looking at it, there seems to be like a little dip almost in the surface of the head right here on this particular back side, the side closest to me. So I may want to keep that in mind. Seems to be a little dip maybe over here as well. And as I'm going, this can be really good visual cues if you're tightening it unevenly. So if you're going, if you haven't gone all the way around yet, give it a second. But if you see some big like dip on one side and you've been tightening for a little while, you've probably done something where you tightened it unevenly, and you might need to backtrack a little bit, loosen things up, and try to even it out. Another thing that you can do is that could just be a little inconsistency in the surface of the head. And so usually, if you look at it, so let's say I have a bubble over here on the back side, I can probably go right to that lug and tighten that a little bit, and that's going to bring it up. And then also, if that doesn't quite do it, maybe across from it. And then, there could be like one that's in between where you might have to work with like two lugs. Like this bubble right here is actually in between these two lugs. So I would probably have to tweak the pair of these a little bit and maybe the ones across from them to get that bubble out. But I'm not going to worry about it yet because I don't really have very much tension on the head at all. So I'm going to start up here. I'm going to do basically a half turn on each of the lugs. Okay, and then also I kind of go by feel a little bit here because you can kind of tell, which once again, this is going to be more like torque. So like how tense it seems when you're turning the screw. Like if I notice one seems really loose, I tend to tighten that a little bit more as I'm going. And if one seems really snug, then I'll not hit that one maybe as hard when I'm trying to tune up on this. So just a little bit like that. And then I'm going to kind of press down on the head and see if there are any wrinkles. If you don't have very high tunings, like for example, I don't usually tune my toms terribly high. Overall, I kind of have them somewhat low so I get this nice punchy sound that I want. And without too much sustain. The higher you go with the tuning, the more sustain, generally speaking, you're going to get up to a certain point. So you can push down here and help it settle a little bit more. And then also see if there's any like wrinkles in the head. Also depending if you're like pushing, further to one side, obviously that's going to make a difference too. But so So I have a little bit of wrinkles, but I'm not going to be too worried about those. Right now it's still quite loose, so at this point you may not even be able to hear if there's really... But in this case you can. So right now, all four of these lugs are pretty tight, and you can hear that these two over here, the head sounds a little more loose, so I'm actually going to give both of these a little more attention. As I was doing before, you know, I heard that this one was lower, so I started over here to tune across from it, right, like we talked about earlier. But what I found is when I was changing this a little bit, it wasn't bringing this up the way it normally would with just a little bit of a turn. So I had to come over here and tighten it, and it instantly goes a lot higher, right? So I'm actually going to loosen this guy up a little bit, bring that guy up a little bit. Same thing, this a little bit tighter, that a little bit looser. And then I wouldn't stress out, like if you have that kind of, like I had a pretty big gap between the sound of these two, tune a little bit and try to get them closer. But if there's a pretty big gap like that, you may want to go around and check the others first, because like in this case I've got now this lug is pretty high over here and these guys are loose, so that's going to affect all of them to a certain extent. So so I'm getting those to where they're all pretty even. And now, one thing, if you're going to be putting a new head on, I kind of know that I have these heads fairly well balanced before, the bottom and the top, and that's going to be kind of useful because then I can use the bottom head when I'm hitting it as a reference for like if I've gone too high or too low with this top head. That being said, I'm sure over the last month that I haven't played this particular tom, that is probably loosened up a bit too, but not a huge deal. But basically, another thing I like to do sometimes too when you're putting on a new drum head is sometimes you can tune it a little bit sharp, like a little bit higher, a little bit tighter than you normally would. It's gonna, it's gonna loosen up a little bit over the next couple of days, so might as well go a little bit tighter and stretch the head a little bit more, and then you can bring it back down if it's, for whatever reason, settles without going down enough for you. But let's see. Let's see if my... So now one thing that's kind of confusing sometimes too is with thinner heads, like the one on the bottom head of my toms, and same thing with snare drum, the thinner heads tend to have higher overtones, right? So sometimes you can hear those overtones and you're like, oh, that drum head's tuned higher. And it might actually be the case. So it's kind of a little bit of a practice and a little bit of a skill to listen kind of through some of those overtones and focus on the main pitch. So this head is actually tighter, my batter head, than my bottom head. So this one also needs to be tuned though, I think, in terms of making it even. So. really is sometimes difficult with those super thin heads. There's a lot of overtones you can get from those, so it's not really perfect at this point. So I'll probably tweak it a little more later, but at this point I think I'm going to go down a little bit, actually, on this rack tom, the top head. Try to get it closer to my bottom head, which is more the pitch I want. That's not too bad. Still a little bit higher, but I'm getting close. Another thing too, as far as deciding what pitch you want either one of them to be, and which other one, like which of them should be matching to the other, a lot of that's going to be, you know, a little bit of experimentation. You might want to try and find drums that you sound good and say, oh, listen to that pitch and see if you can kind of try to match that in a song if you have like a drummer you really like. But also, one thing to take into consideration too is the drums themselves. So, you know, different types of wood that the drum's made of, the size, the thickness of the shell, all that stuff. Different drums are going to respond better at different pitches. So I don't really stress too much like trying to find a perfect pitch in terms of, ooh, I want all of my drums to be tuned to, you know, 440A is like the bass, and I just go off of that, you know, all of them are tuned to a specific note. I go more for like, does this drum sound resonant or like have the right like tone qualities that I want with the pitch that I've gotten out of it. So I focus more on the overall like tone quality than I do on the exact pitch. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. So I think I like overall where the batter head's at, and it's a little bit higher. So I'm going to bring this head up some, the bottom head, to match it. And I think it'll be just about set on this drum. Now it's too high, of course. Because it didn't take much to go up here. That's better. So right now I'm getting slightly higher on the bottom, but really not a bad tone for me. I'm kind of happy with that. So the last thing I want to talk about, I've got some other heads to replace, but you guys get the gist. So the last thing I want to talk about is muffling and some of the different tone options you can get once you have your drum head pretty much tuned. If you're still kind of like scratching your head like, why did I spend, you know, 50, 70 bucks on brand new drum heads and they still have some ring or something, I wanted to talk about, for example, moon gels are a common thing. They're these little blue sticky, stretchy little things you put on your drum head, little rectangles, and they'll kind of dampen some of those overtones and probably shorten the sustain as well. You can use one or more of these. You can cut them in half if you want a little bit less, but you put those on there and that'll make a pretty big difference in the ring. Hopefully you can hear it over here, but there's a decent amount of sustain to it now. Pretty big difference there as far as the amount of sustain. That's actually a little too much for me, so honestly, I'd be more concerned with muffling the bottom head a little bit. So I'd maybe put this on there, or maybe just a little bit of tape. Probably half of one of these would do it, cut in half. That got rid of some of the little bit of harsh overtones that we had from the bottom head, so I like that. I would probably stick with one of these on the bottom. And yeah, so you can experiment with that. The other thing we can do is rings. People will buy rings that are maybe about like 1.5 inches, depending on the size of the ring. It's going to be a little more narrow if it's a small drum, wider if it's a bigger drum, and that just goes around the edge. It kind of acts like our overtone control ring that's built into this drum head, where we can kind of put it on there, and that's going to create quite a bit of sustain and overtone ring dampening, but those are a little overkill for me usually, so I don't really use that kind of thing. There's even different versions of these now that are a little bit less. They're not quite so much dampening as these are, so you can experiment with those as well. And the last thing, if you really want like a different tone, or like either as an effect, or you really just want like little sustain, you can take, as I did, an old drum head, okay? So So this is a 16-inch tom head. I cut the metal rim that goes around this, that gives it the structure. I cut that off, so I just have the center piece. And I have a nice big floor tom here that I already have tuned pretty low. But there is like a decent amount of sustain. If I put this on here, it cuts the sustain. It also is making it so that I'm hearing a lot more of the low frequencies, because just having these different pieces of plastic resting on each other is getting rid of all those higher frequencies, so it kind of sounds instantly lower and punchier, and it kind of almost has more of like a bass drum sound to it now, rather than a tom sound. Alright, so you can do that right away. So it's a great way to use old scrap heads just to get an effect out of your drums. So I'll probably take that 10-inch head and cut out that so I can put it on my drum set with my 10-inch tom and have that as an extra little piece of something to adjust my drum kit sound if I want to for different things. So hopefully this has been helpful for everyone. Again, my name is Jared Johnson with Music Compound, drum instructor. We are still doing private lessons virtually, so you know, if you have someone who's interested, need to kill a little bit of time now that you're stuck in your house, please give us a call, 941-379-9100. Talk to Kaylee or Jenny, we'll get you set up. We also have a lot of online Facebook like tutorials like this one going on backstage. We also are doing trivia nights and that kind of thing, so please tune into Music Compounds on Facebook, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.